How did Elizabeth I control the country? So in this video, we're going to think about some of the different ways that the country could be governed under Elizabeth. If we're going to think about how successful she was or how effective she was, we need to think about what tools she had at her disposal, what things could she have done, and therefore we can then later on start to think about how effective she was at dealing with those problems when we know the ability she had and the ways in which she was able to control them in the first place. We need to think then about how society was structured in Elizabeth's time. Elizabethans were really fond of social hierarchy. So they had something called the Elizabethan chain of being, which is something we'll look at a little bit more later on. At the top is God. God is the person that grants power to Elizabeth. So Elizabeth's power comes from God. It's that belief in divine right. And she's Protestant as well, so it's worth bearing that in mind. Below Elizabeth is the nobility. Your nobility are your most powerful class of people within Elizabethan society. They are your landowners. They are people who are rich enough to be able to afford big houses without necessarily having to work for a living. They have lots of people they employ on their land, and they are the people who have the top jobs within Elizabethan society at the court, in the Privy Council. They have the biggest sway in Parliament. Below them are your gentry. Your gentry class is your middle class. They're people who maybe have their own businesses. They're people who are perhaps lawyers, and they are growing in number rapidly during Elizabeth's reign. Below them are yeomen. They are sort of farmers who own land. They employ the tenant farmers below them. Below them, you've got your labouring poor, people who have to work for others, and at the very bottom, your vagrants, your homeless, your poor who rely on begging in order to make a living. This slide just tells us a little bit more about that power structure. You've got the monarch at the top, below the monarch, the Privy Council who advise her, Parliament, and then local government, because she's going to have that issue of how she controls the whole of the country when she's in London. So what was the royal court? Well, that was wherever the Queen happened to be. It's not the same as the government, it just exists wherever the Queen was. So it consists of all the people in her household, her ladies in waiting, as well as her servants, but also her nobles and advisors, including people who were in the Privy Council as well. It's mainly in London at the Palace of Whitehall, but there are also other palaces. So you've got a picture of Nonsuch Palace here. And when she goes on her progresses, the royal court goes with her. In this image, you can see Elizabeth being carried, and this is what would happen on her progresses. So they would literally progress across the country. But when we say the country, we actually only really mean the southeast. They didn't make it as far as the north, and they probably wouldn't have wanted to come up north anyway, because lots of the north were Catholic and didn't particularly like having a Protestant queen. So she would take her court to visit homes of her nobles during the summer months. It was a bit like a holiday. It was really expensive for those families to have her there, though, because they had to fund 500 people. But it gave her population a chance to see her and to experience this kind of personal monarchy, as a lot of historians refer to it, to see her in person and see all of the propaganda that was associated with her image. The historian Christopher Hay calls them major public relations exercises, and that's definitely something that's worth bearing in mind. Parliament in Elizabeth's reign was very different from Parliament today. It wasn't a democracy meaning power to the people, where people have a vote. That wasn't really the case. There was no prime minister, there were no political parties, most people couldn't vote for them anyway. The only people who could vote were really rich men who own lots of land. And Elizabeth doesn't particularly like Parliament. We know that because she doesn't call it very often, 13 times in 45 years. But the main two things we need to know about Parliament are that it was for tax and for passing laws. So in this image, we can see that Elizabeth is right at the top of Parliament. Those people that she trusts would have been seated much closer to her, and those people further away would have been less important. So we can see that idea of hierarchy coming into play in this image of what Parliament was like. And as we said on the previous slide, it's mainly there to pass laws and raise taxes. They're going to both be very important throughout Elizabeth's reign, particularly as that threat towards her increases, because if you're going to fight wars, you're going to need money in order to do that. You're going to need to pass laws in order to protect yourself. So Parliament is going to become more and more important for Elizabeth when she is under threat. Throughout her reign, we see that Elizabeth did have quite a lot of control over Parliament. She's the only person that can call Parliament to sit. and she's the only person that can close it or prorogue it. It's a good word to use. So she dissolves it essentially when she doesn't want it anymore. We can see she doesn't call it very often. She controls how long it meets for. She decides what topics can be discussed. She uses Parliament to her advantage. She makes sure that they can't discuss things she doesn't like. So we see that during the succession crisis in 1562, when she gets smallpox after that, Parliament are really keen for her to marry and produce an heir. She says this is a matter of royal prerogative. Basically, stop discussing it. I will decide, and I will make those decisions, not you. Privy Council and Parliament aren't the same thing at all. Privy Council's probably more useful to her, and they're the people that advise her on a daily basis, and they give her advice on the day-to-day running of the country, check that the government is working effectively. It's led by the Secretary of State and made up of different advisors who give her advice on all sorts of issues. It meets about 3 times a week. They debate any of the problems that she's experiencing, and they make sure that what she wants actually happens. The 2 pictures at the bottom of this slide are 2 people we really need to know about. Francis Walsingham is her spy master. He's the person that foils the plots to replace Elizabeth with Mary Queen of Scots that get a lot of support from people in the north who are Catholic and who want to replace Protestant Elizabeth with Catholic Mary Queen of Scots. The other person that we need to know about is William Cecil, and he's her most trusted advisor throughout her reign. She's really reluctant to let him retire. He's discreet, he's loyal, and she really trusts him. William Cecil's one of those people we need to know quite a bit about. He's Elizabeth's most trusted and most loyal advisor throughout the course of her reign. In 1571, she gives him the title of Lord Burghley, which is like an honour because of his service towards her. And she really does value him because he's loyal, he's discreet, he's cautious. He isn't going to make decisions without considering the implications. He isn't going to rush into war or any other kind of decision. So that makes him really valuable and a voice of reason around her. He's succeeded by his son, Robert Cecil, who's sort of been trained up a bit by William Cecil to take over the role, but Robert Cecil isn't quite as good as his dad, but he's somebody to be aware of in the 1590s later on in her reign. One thing that's worth bearing in mind regarding Elizabeth's advice and the Privy Council is that she reduces that influence that it had in Mary's reign. So Mary had about 40 people in her Privy Council. Elizabeth takes that down to 19 because she thinks that would make it easier to control. There's such a thing as too much advice, and she wants to make sure that the advice she's getting is from people that she really does value and really does rate. One of the issues Elizabeth has is how you govern the whole of England. That's really difficult because of communication problems that were inherent at that time. So in order to do that, there are 2 groups of people we need to know about. The first one are Lord Lieutenants. Now, Lord Lieutenants are appointed by the Queen and they run particular areas of the country. So they have the responsibility of raising an army if she needed extra protection or if there was a threat. They would raise a local militia. Many of these men are also in the Privy Council as well, so they're one way that she makes sure that messages are heard in all parts of the country. You also have Justices of the Peace, or JPs, and there are a few of those in each county, and they are basically responsible for law and order, and if you like, policing, but the police force isn't invented until Queen Victoria's reign. That's a relatively new thing. So JPs are another way in which she tries to ensure that she is able to run the country as a whole. It's much, much easier for things to be done in London, and that's possibly why throughout her reign and throughout the reigns of her family members, things always happen in London first and in the southeast because it takes much longer for things to sort of filter up to Lancashire, for example. So therefore you have far more Catholic people in Lancashire because they have been less willing to convert and they feel much, much further away from what's going on in London. So they're much more likely to do their own thing and to govern themselves to an extent. But obviously as a monarch, she's got to make sure that her laws are implemented throughout the whole country. So this is one of the things that she does in order to try and achieve that.